Welcome to Shadow Warefare. This channel exists for one reason, to expose what operates in the shadows and to teach you how to shut it down permanently. This is not entertainment. This is not religion for likes. This is spiritual intelligence from someone who has seen both sides of the battlefield. If you are new here, understand this clearly. I do not speak from theory. I speak from experience. I am an ex-witch. I have stood in circles where curses were spoken. I have watched families targeted, bloodlines monitored, children mocked before they could even speak. And I have also watched those same attacks collapse instantly when certain verses were spoken with authority. Today's message is one many witches never wanted exposed. Because once you understand this, entire bloodlines become untouchable. The topic of this video is this: X-Witch exposes the 4 Psalm verses that make witches unable to curse your family. Not slow them down, not delay them, not weaken them, unable. If you are watching this and you have ever felt like attacks come in cycles, if you have noticed patterns of sickness, sudden accidents, unexplained hatred, financial strangulation, or repeated marital tension that doesn't make sense, if you have prayed before but felt like something was resisting the answer, then stay focused, because what I'm about to share is not common church teaching. These verses were feared in the witchcraft world, not because they sound poetic, but because of what they activate in the spirit realm. Let me say this clearly before I go further. Witches do not fear loud Christians. They do not fear emotional prayers. They fear specific spiritual legal language, and Psalms is full of it. When witches curse a family, they don't just throw words into the air. They look for legal access, open doors, bloodline weaknesses, spoken agreements, trauma, unforgiveness, fear, silence, ignorance. But there are certain verses, especially in Psalms, that do something dangerous to witchcraft operations. These verses don't argue with darkness. They summon enforcement. I remember the first time I saw this happen. We had targeted a household. Everything was aligned. The ritual was clean. The timing was right. The signs were clear. The spirits were already assigned. But the attack kept bouncing back. Not once, not twice. Every time, confusion hit the circle. Divination went blind. The familiar spirits could not report. Later, we found out why. The mother in that house didn't pray long prayers. She didn't even know much theology. But every night, without fail, she spoke a specific psalm out loud over her children. Same verses, same order, same authority. That family was removed from the list, not because they were invisible, but because they were legally protected. This is what I need you to understand. Spiritual warfare is legal before it is powerful, and Psalms is a book of legal decrees disguised as worship. The first witch's fear is Psalm 91, but not the part everyone quotes casually. The danger starts when verse 1 is spoken as a declaration, not a request. When someone says they dwell, not that they wish to dwell. When someone understands that a dwelling means residency, not visitation. In witchcraft, residency matters. Authority is territorial. When Psalm 91 is spoken correctly, it announces jurisdiction. It tells the spirit realm that this family is under a higher covering and that unauthorized access is forbidden. But here is what most people don't know. When Psalm 91 is spoken consistently over a family, it creates something witches recognize instantly. A perimeter, not symbolic, not emotional. A real boundary, the kind that causes spiritual backlash if crossed without permission. That's why witches avoid families that speak it with understanding. Because crossing that boundary without legal clearance results in consequences for the witch, not the family. The second verse that disrupts witchcraft operations comes from Psalm 35. This psalm is not gentle, it is not polite, and that's exactly why it works. Witches rely on silence. They rely on passive faith. Psalm 35 does the opposite. It calls for divine engagement. It activates pursuit. It reverses intent. When verse 1 is spoken, "Plead my cause, O Lord, with them that strive with me." It does something terrifying to dark operations. It summons a higher court. It declares that the conflict is no longer between the witch and the family. It is now between the witch and God. In the witchcraft world, this is called escalation, and escalation is dangerous. because once God is legally invited to contend, every hidden altar, every spoken curse, every monitored target is exposed. Spirits cannot hide information anymore. Assignments lose coordinate. Confusion enters the enemy camp. I watched rituals fall apart because someone prayed Psalm 35 without even knowing why it worked. The third verse, witches' fear, comes from Psalm 121. This one is subtle, and because it is subtle, it is deadly to dark surveillance. Witches monitor families. They observe sleep cycles, emotional states, weak moments. Psalm 121 shuts that down. When someone declares that their help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth, it sounds harmless. But in the spirit realm, it announces supply source. And when verse 4 is spoken, he who keeps Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps, it creates a problem for witches, because witches work in watches, timings, midnight hours, transitional moments. Psalm 121 announces that there is no unguarded moment, no sleep gap, no unattended hour. That means no window. No window means no entry. And when witches realize there is no entry point, they move on, because forced entry brings consequences they are not willing to pay. The fourth Psalm verse is the one most witches hate the most, because it doesn't just block curses, it rebounds them. Psalm 109. This psalm is not taught in most churches because it is confrontational, but in witchcraft circles, it is well known. When verse 17 is spoken about curses returning to the one who loves them, it activates spiritual recoil. It doesn't require visualization. It doesn't require motion. It requires agreement, and agreement is everything. When a family consistently speaks this verse, witches mark that household as hazardous, because anything sent does not disappear. It returns with evidence, and witches fear evidence. I need you to understand something important. These verses don't work because they are ancient poetry. They work because they are legal spiritual language that aligns the family with divine jurisdiction. You don't have to shout them. You don't have to fast for 7 days to activate. You have to believe what you're declaring and speak it consistently. That consistency is what builds spiritual immunity over a family. In witchcraft, families are not attacked randomly. They are tested, probed, observed. Before a full curse is released, there is always a monitoring phase. Small disturbances are introduced to see how the household responds. Sudden arguments, strange dreams, unexplained fatigue, minor financial leaks. The goal is not damage yet, the goal is information. Witches ask questions through these tests. Does the family pray out loud or only silently? Do they respond with fear or authority? Do they speak scripture or complain? Do they stop praying when life gets busy? This is why consistency matters more than intensity. A family that prays emotionally once a week but stays silent the rest of the time is considered vulnerable. But a family that calmly speaks the same verses daily, even without emotion, is considered dangerous because repetition establishes law. Let me explain something most churches never teach. In the spirit realm, repetition is not vain when it is legal language. It is reinforced. It's the same reason witches repeat chants. Not because spirits didn't hear the first time, but because repetition strengthens jurisdiction. When psalm verses are spoken daily over a family, something begins to form. It's not a feeling, it's a record. The spirit realm keeps records. That's why witches document prayer habits. They listen. They observe. They track what verses are used and when they stop. Yes, when they stop. One of the biggest secrets I can expose is this. Many families lose protection not because a witch became stronger, but because the family stopped speaking what was keeping the doors sealed. Now let's talk about timing, because timing is everything in spiritual warfare. Midnight is not powerful because it's spooky. It's powerful because it is a transition point. It's the moment one day legally ends and another begins. In witchcraft, transitions are used to rewrite outcomes. This is why witches prefer midnight. But here's what they don't want you to know. When a family speaks psalm verses during the night watches, even once, it disrupts witchcraft scheduling. It interrupts ritual timing. It confuses assigned spirits because the legal environment has shifted. Psalm 91 spoken at night does not do the same thing as Psalm 91 spoken casually during the day. At night, it becomes a declaration of night authority. When verse 5 talks about not fearing the terror by night, witches hear something different. They hear resistance to night operations. That's why witches hate households that pray before sleep and immediately after waking, because those moments seal the transition points. Now let me expose how witches respond when these psalm verses are active. First, they attempt diversion, distraction, fatigue. You suddenly feel too tired to pray. Nice words. You forget. You tell yourself you'll do it tomorrow. That's not random. Second, they attempt substitution. They push you toward generic prayers instead of specific scripture. I just talk to God, they whisper. Not because talking is bad, but because specific verses carry specific authority. Third, if that doesn't work, they attempt intimidation, dreams, fear, images, sounds, sleep paralysis, anything to make you associate prayer with discomfort. This is how witches test whether a family will retreat. Families that stop speaking scripture after intimidation are marked as accessible again, but families that continue, especially calmly, are marked as off-limits. Calm authority terrifies darkness more than emotional panic ever will. Now let me tell you something very personal. When I left Witchcraft, I was terrified. Not of God, but of retaliation. I knew what I had been part of. I knew what was possible, and I expected consequences. But something unexpected happened. The families that spoke psalms with understanding were untouched. Not one of them experienced backlash. Not one. But those who relied on fear-based prayers, protection objects, or silence. Those families suffered. That's when I realized something profound. Protection is not about hiding. It's about alignment. Psalms aligns a family with divine law. Let's talk about children because this matters deeply. Children don't need to understand the verses for the verses to work. Authority flows downward. When parents speak psalms over their children, it places a covering that children grow into. In witchcraft, children are targeted early because they are future carriers of destiny. But children raised under spoken scripture develop something witches recognize immediately: resistance. Their dreams are guarded. Their emotional state is stable. Their spiritual sensitivity is protected. That's why witches avoid homes where parents speak psalms over sleeping children. And yes, sleep matters. Most attacks happen during sleep because consciousness is lowered. But psalms spoken before sleep establish night governance. I want you to imagine this like a legal notice posted on a door. It doesn't argue with intruders. It doesn't threaten. It simply states jurisdiction. And jurisdiction is everything. Now let me address something controversial but necessary. Many people ask, what if someone in my family is not righteous? Will these verses still work? The answer is yes, if spoken by someone with authority in the household. Witchcraft targets authority figures first: fathers, mothers, elders, because authority determines coverage. If even one person with authority consistently speaks these verses, the household benefits. This is why witches try to isolate prayer warriors within families. They try to make you feel weird, but extreme, fanatical, because once you stop, the door reopens. Never let mockery silence your authority. Now listen carefully to this next part, because this is one of the most important truths you will ever hear. Psalms does not work as a magic formula. It works as an agreement with divine enforcement. If you speak these verses while secretly trusting fear more than God, you weaken their effect. But if you speak them with quiet certainty, even without emotion, they stand. Faith is not volume. Faith is alignment. This is why witches fear calm believers more than loud ones. Calm believers know something. They know who is responsible for enforcement. Now there is something else that needs to be exposed. Witches cannot curse what they cannot legally locate. Psalm 121 declares surveillance failure. Psalm 91 declares boundary violation consequences. Psalm 35 declares escalation. Psalm 109 declares reversal. Together, these verses create a system, not a ritual, a system. And systems are harder to break than single prayers. This is why I tell families not to jump from verse to verse randomly. Choose these verses, speak them consistently, teach them to your children, whisper them if you must, but don't abandon them, because abandonment is interpreted as surrender. Now let me tell you what happens when witches realize they are blocked. They don't always stop immediately. Sometimes they attempt indirect attacks through third parties, gossip, accusations, false friendships, unexpected conflicts. But even these fail when psalms are active, because the spirit behind the attack still needs access, and access is denied. I've seen witches become frustrated, angry, confused, because nothing sticks. That's when they move on. Not because they respect you, but because the cost is too high. Now listen closely, because this is where many people unknowingly cancel their own protection. Speaking psalm verses is not about speed, perfection, or dramatic delivery. In the spirit realm, clarity and intention matter more than rhythm. Witches don't listen for beauty. They listen for authority. And authority is recognized by certainty. When a verse is spoken slowly, clearly, and without doubt, it lands like a legal stamp. But when it is rushed, mumbled or spoken while distracted, it becomes weak. Not because the verse lacks power, but because the speaker is not fully present. Presence is agreement. One of the biggest mistakes families make is turning scripture into background noise, playing it while doing 10 other things, letting it run while scrolling. That may build atmosphere, but it does not always establish authority. Authority requires participation. This is why witches never multitask during rituals. Focus is everything. Now let me expose another mistake. Mixing fear language with faith language. Saying Psalm 91, and then immediately saying, I hope nothing bad happens tonight. That cancels alignment. The spirit realm responds to the dominant declaration. If fear is the last word spoken, fear becomes the agreement. This is why witches attempt to provoke fear immediately after prayer, through thoughts, sensations, or distractions. They want to overwrite the declaration. Don't let them. If fear arises, speak the verse again, calmly, not aggressively. Calm authority is unshakable. Now let's talk about why some families experience temporary resistance after they start speaking these verses. This is important. When a household that was previously unguarded suddenly becomes protected, existing assignments don't disappear instantly. They attempt to complete their task before jurisdiction fully shifts. This can feel like an increase in activity, not because prayer is failing, but because protection is activating. This phase does not last long if consistency is maintained. Witches call this the last push. If a family panics and stops praying during this phase, the attack intensifies later. But if the family remains steady, the assignment collapses permanently. This is why I always say, do not judge prayer by how you feel in the first few days. Judge it by what remains weeks later. Now let me expose something very few people talk about. Bloodlines are remembered in the spirit realm. If your family has a history of witchcraft, idolatry, occult involvement, or covenant rituals, even generations back, there may be standing permissions that witches attempt to reactivate. But Psalms does something unique. It overrides ancestral permissions by establishing present authority. The spirit realm recognizes current jurisdiction over historical access. This is why a single generation can end cycles that existed for centuries, but only if they speak. Silence preserves old agreements. Speech establishes new ones. This is why witches hate testimonies, because testimony is speech, and speech changes records. Now listen carefully. You do not need to confront witches. You do not need to expose names. You do not need to go looking for enemies. Speaking psalms is not about fighting. It's about fortifying. Witches lose interest when access is denied. They prefer easy targets. Confused households. Divided families. Unity strengthens coverage. If possible, speak these verses together as a family, even once a week. There is something powerful about collective agreement. But even if you're alone, your voice still counts. Authority is not about numbers. It's about position. Now let me explain why witches fear Psalm 109 so deeply. In witchcraft, consequences are usually delayed. They assume they have time to cleanse, reverse, or deflect. But Psalm 109 accelerates consequence. It shortens the return cycle. When curses return quickly, witches panic. They suspect exposure. They fear higher intervention. That's why Psalm 109 is rarely taught openly. It doesn't sound nice. But warfare is not about niceness. It's about justice. And justice terrifies darkness. Now let's address dreams again, because many people experience dreams when psalms are active. Not all dreams are attacks, but some are purges. When protection activates, suppressed spiritual residue surfaces before leaving. This can appear as strange dreams. Do not fear this. Fear feeds residue. Authority clears it. Speak psalms before sleep and after waking. This seals the transition. Now let me give you something practical, without turning this into instructions or headings. Choose a time. Over your family, over your home. Do not add fear commentary. Do not rush. Do not skip days casually. This is not superstition. This is alignment. After a few weeks, something will change. Not fireworks, not drama, peace. And peace is the greatest indicator of protection. Witches cannot operate in peace-filled environments. Peace disrupts surveillance. It clouds divination. That's why chaos is always the first goal of an attack. Now listen to this carefully. Once peace is established, maintain it. Do not assume you can stop speaking because everything feels fine now. That's how doors reopen. Maintenance matters. Now let me say something that might surprise you. Protection is not paranoia. Protection is discipline. You lock your doors at night without fear. You don't panic every time you do it. You simply do it. Speaking psalms should feel the same. Normal, steady, non-negotiable. This is how families remain untouchable for generations. Now, before I continue further, I need to speak directly to someone watching this. If you feel like this message is heavier than usual, if something in you is resisting hearing it, if you feel suddenly distracted or uncomfortable, that is not coincidence. Truth disrupts hidden agreements. When a bloodline becomes legally closed, something irreversible happens in the spirit realm. It's not dramatic on the surface, but it is final underneath. Witches recognize closure the same way lawyers recognize a sealed case. They can look at it, but they cannot reopen it without consequences. Let me explain how families end up on monitoring lists in the first place. In witchcraft, monitoring is passive until permission is detected. Permission doesn't always come from deliberate occult activity. It often comes from trauma responses, repeated fear statements, spoken hopelessness, or identity agreements like, "We always struggle, and nothing ever works for us," or "this runs in our family." Those statements are not emotional vents in the spirit realm. They are signatures. When a family repeatedly agrees with defeat, witches don't even need to curse aggressively. They just reinforce what's already being spoken. But when psalm verses are introduced consistently, something very different happens. Those old statements lose authority because scripture outranks personal history. This is why witches fear families that understand authority rather than just belief. Belief is internal. Authority is external. Authority changes environments. Now let me tell you how witches know a family has become permanently closed. First, divination fails. Tools give contradictory results. Dreams become unclear. Assigned spirits report silence. Second, attempts to stir emotional chaos stop working. Arguments don't escalate. Provocation falls flat. The family responds differently. And this is the most important. Fear responses disappear. Witches track fear like heat signatures. When fear drops, visibility drops. Psalm-based households become spiritually cold to surveillance. This is why witches say certain families disappear, even though they are still living normal lives. They didn't vanish. They became untraceable. Now let me address something many people are afraid to ask. What if someone already cursed my family years ago? What if damage already happened? Here is the truth. Curses are sustained by agreement. When agreement ends, the curse starves. Psalm verses don't just block future attacks. They deactivate existing ones by removing the environment they feed on. This is why some people experience emotional release, sudden clarity, or unexpected peace after weeks of consistent scripture. That's not coincidence. That's residue leaving. Witches know when a curse is starving. It stops producing symptoms. It stops responding to reinforcement. That's when they abandon it, because maintaining a starving curse drains resources. Now listen carefully to this next part, because this is where many families accidentally reopen doors. They stop speaking when life improves. Improvement is not the signal to stop. It's the signal that alignment is working. Maintenance keeps doors sealed. Now I want to talk about something deeply misunderstood: anger. Psalm 35 and Psalm 109 contain strong language. Some people feel uncomfortable speaking them because they associate strength with cruelty. But justice is not cruelty. In witchcraft, justice language is feared because it removes manipulation. It calls for balance. Witches rely on imbalance, hidden advantage, silence. Justice levels the field. Speaking these verses does not make you aggressive. It makes you aligned. Now let me tell you something from first-hand experience. The most protected families I encountered were not obsessed with witchcraft. They didn't hunt demons. They didn't obsess over enemies. They lived normal lives. They worked. They laughed. They rested. And they spoke scripture consistently. That's it. Darkness feeds on attention. Psalms denies it. Now I want to speak directly to parents again. Your children do not need to be afraid of the world to be protected from it. Fear actually weakens their discernment. But children raised under spoken scripture develop confidence without knowing why. They don't feel hunted. They feel held. That alone makes them unattractive targets. Now listen to this carefully. Once a family becomes legally closed, attacks don't escalate. They reroute. Darkness looks for easier access elsewhere. That's why protection is not selfish. It actually reduces overall harm. Protected families reduce available targets. This is why witches fear widespread understanding of Psalms, because it collapses their operating environment. Now let me address something many people misunderstand about authority. Authority does not require perfection. You don't lose protection because you had a bad day. You don't lose authority because you felt discouraged. Authority is positional, not emotional. What matters is whether you return to alignment. That's why speaking Psalms after failure is just as powerful as speaking them after success. Return restores jurisdiction. Now let me expose a final tactic witches use when everything else fails. They attempt to create spiritual fatigue. They whisper thoughts like, "This is too much," or "doing too much," "This isn't necessary anymore." That voice is not wisdom. It is resistance. Protection does not need to be exhausting. It needs to be consistent. If speaking 4 verses feels heavy, reduce emotional effort, not frequency. Speak calmly, briefly, faithfully. That's enough. Now listen to this. You do not need permission from a pastor, prophet, or channel to protect your family. Authority was given, not delegated. Psalm verses are not owned by institutions. They are available to households, and households are where real warfare is decided. Now let me bring this to something very important. Once a family is closed, they often become a source of stability for others. People feel peace around them. Conflicts de-escalate. Fear doesn't spread. That's influence, not loud influence. Quiet authority. That's the kind darkness cannot imitate. Now, I want to leave you with this truth. Witches are not omnipotent. They are opportunistic. They look for openings. They avoid resistance. Psalm verses create resistance without noise, and that is why they work. If you have listened this far, it is not accidental. Something in your bloodline is shifting, not emotionally, legally. Keep speaking, keep aligning, keep closing doors. And remember this, darkness does not retreat because it is convinced. It retreats because it is restricted. Your family was never meant to live exposed. Alignment restores what was always yours. Stay covered, stay consistent, stay aware. This is Shadow Warefare.